The snow fell silently over the barren trees, cloaking the English woods in a shroud of icy white. It was winter in the year of our Lord 1003, and the frostbitten land bore witness to a flight, not of heroes, but of hunted men. Two figures pressed forward across the frozen underbrushen, tall and broad as an ox, cloaked in furs and the shadow of fame. The other leaner, slower, with threadbare linen, and the cautious gait of a man, uncertain whether he follows or flees. This was not a journey of equals. Thorkel the Red, infamous Danish warlord and unrepentant pagan, stumbled through these last days of exile with the bearing of a wounded wolf. His companion Togger the Thrall kept quiet steps behind, bearing the satchel, tending the wounds, cooking over hastily built fires. For 25 years, Togger had served him as servant, and sometimes shield, but the weight of that service had grown heavier with every dropping leaf and every gory raid. The woods echoed only their breathing. Agents of King Ethelred spread through the villages and glades, searching for the warlord who had defied the crown. Ethelred had made his offer known, silver and sanctuary for any man who could deliver Thorkel's head. But among the scout whispers that filled local mead halls, men also murmured of a strange clause. Should a thrall do the deed, freedom would be granted, and with it, land, a name, and the warm embrace of the church. Inside the cracked shell of a forest hut, the fugitives took refuge. As firelight flickered over their faces, Thorkel muttered of Odin and vengeance, of victories long lost, unwilling to reckon with the finality settling in his bones. And Togger, he brewed stew from roots and silence. Somewhere between his master's bloodied boots and the floor where he slept, something inside him churned more than rebellion, more than fear. Outside, bare trees stretched like skeletal arms toward a pale grey sky. Each breath came with a puff of white, each hour thickened with waiting. Yet beneath the stillness, history was shifting, because within 3 days, a sword would flash in that hut. Servitude, loyalty, traditional, would rupture in a single stroke of steel. The woods would remain silent witnesses. But the world beyond them would never see Togger the same way again. Snow didn't fall the same on a thrall's back. It bit harder because there was no fire waiting, no shelter offered freely. For Togger, the snow was constant, just like the weight of his collar, even if that collar was invisible now. He had stood in the mead halls of warriors, served meals to gods on men's tongues, watched kings piss in corner sand, all of it, from the same hunched, silent posture. He had not always been like this. Born of Saxon blood, his first memories were not fields, but flames. A Danish raid had come swift and merciless on his village when he was not yet 10. His father tried to fight. His mother tried to hide. Both tried. Neither succeeded. They spared the children after all. The Norse needed servants. Thralls were property, plain and brutal. The sagas rarely spoke of them, unless in mockery or casual cruelty. They were the hands that cooked, stitched, mended armour, dug graves. They were fed what was left, punished when no warrior could be blamed, and reminded at every turn. You are not one of us. Togger grew up under Thorkel's eye in the war camps, hearing stories of Odin and Thor, carving runestones he'd never dare claim as his own. He was given a knife, not as a warrior, but to clean fish. He learned Old Norse before he fully remembered his mother's tongue. Over time, he stopped correcting the way they mispronounced his name. Yet, something else grew in him. Not hatred, not at first, but a silence, deeper than obedience. He watched how men laughed with their bondsmen when drunk, then flogged them the morning after. He saw how a slave could save his master's life in battle, and still sleep on dirt that night. He bore witness, and he remembered. Thorkel, to his creditor, curse-trusted him more than most. Togger was allowed to carry coin, to speak freely at times, and once even shared a horn of mead at a solstice feast. But there was always the wall, invisible, immutable. You are not us. For 25 years he served. He bled beside wolves but was treated like a dog. They called him Thorkel the Redknot for the colour of his hair, but for the trail of blood and fire he left across the coasts of England and Normandy. For decades, he carved his name into the bones of villages, monasteries and battlefields. A thunderous avatar of Norse fury, taller than most, broad in shoulder and thick-necked. He commanded not only ships, but the souls of the men beneath him. His presence at the prow of a longship was enough to send coastal settlements into chaos. When he arrived, prayers to Christ mingled with the smoke of burning thatch. But Thorkel did not pray. He sacrificed to Odin and trusted steel before spirits. Thorkel first rose under the banner of the great Danish warlords who defied Saxon rule with fire and axe. Unlike others who raided for silver and women, Thorkel wanted more: territory, power, permanence. He led men at the Battle of Maldon, terrified coastal England during the Viking invasions of 991, and served for a time as both butcher and negotiator in the shifting allegiances of Viking and Saxon diplomacy. He was no crude berserker. Politically savvy, Thorkel learned to navigate the thin ice between war and loyalty. Yet his heart remained with old gods and old ways. Even when other Danes converted for convenience to gain Saxon titles or land under the Christian crown, Thorkel refused. He mocked the cross, refused the king's coin when it came with a baptism, and spat on the Saxon priests who attempted to convert him. His warband followed because, in him, they saw ancient strength, the last true Viking before the wave of Christianity diluted their blood. To his thrall, Togger, he was both captor and teacher. For 25 years, Togger dressed Thorkel's wounds, cooked his meat, and cleaned the blood from his axe. Thorkel called him "my shadow in the mud," and there was something close to twisted affection between them. Some nights in the longhouse, Thorkel would speak to Togger as one does a dog, indulgently, dismissively, but not without familiarity, yet never as equal, never as man. As the tide of power shifted in favour of Christian kings and Anglo-Saxon nobles, Thorkel's refusal to kneel made him a relic in a world that now demanded conformity. By 1003, he was hunted, branded outlaw by both Danes who sought peace and Saxons who demanded vengeance. And still, he would not bend. "Let them come," he had growled on the eve of his last battle. The forest was unforgiving. Each breath came sharp in the lungs, the cold gnawing at skin and bone alike. For days, Togger and Thorkel moved under cover of darkness, stealing food from abandoned farms and drinking snowmelt from cupped hands. Thorkel, once the terror of the Saxon coast, now limped through the undergrowth, his leg wounded at the river crossing where his last band of warriors had scattered. Togger supported him without word or complaint, just as he had for decades. But something had changed. The silence between them was heavier than the snow-laden branches overhead. Thorkel, fevered and wounded, muttered prayers to Odin, while Togger whispered no god's name at all. He kept his distance, both physically and within his eyes. It was impossible to say if it was fatigue, fear, or something colder forming behind them. By the fourth night, they had found refuge in a crumbling charcoal burner's hut. It stank of damp smoke and old rot, but it was a wall against the wind. Thorkel collapsed beside the hearth, and Togger kindled a reluctant flame. Over meagre embers, they shared dried meat in silence, the master unable, or unwilling, to speak a word of fear. The crackle of the fire echoed loudly in the tight wooden walls. Togger was not only tired, he was uncertain. Each moment beside the warlord he had once almost admired now magnified the wounds of servitude. Here was a man he had followed into battle, tended through sickness, praised in poems he hadn't written yet. He remained boy, dog, and thrall in Thorkel's eyes. Not once had he been called friend. When he stepped outside that night, gazing up at the icy stars, he found himself reciting the words he had overheard from enemy scouts days earlier, spoken after the rout. Silver, land. The bribe hung in the cold air like a spectre. Inside the hut, Thorkel snored, soft and vulnerable for the first time Togger could recall. Something peeled loose inside the thrall. Was it conscience, or was it survival? The two had long fused in him, indistinguishable. He did not act that night. But as dawn broke, and he washed Thorkel's bloodied bandage in the stream, he saw his own reflection in the ripples, and in it, not a man who obeyed, but one who had grown tired of kneeling. They were fugitives, yes, but not from kings or death. In the bitter hush of the forest, sheltered by pine and hoarfrost, Togger tended the fading embers of a fire. Thorkel the Red slept beside him, wrapped in a cloak stitched with the blood of battles past. Snow melted in the folds of his fur-lined boots, pooling beneath Togger's knees, a familiar discomfort. Despite everything, the thrall's hands moved with practiced care, mending wounds and warming broth for a man he both feared and once revered. What binds a man to another for 25 years? Not love nor choice, but chains, both seen and unseen. Togger had once been free, a Saxon child running barefoot through meadows now trampled by iron and conquest. The screaming came first, then the fire. Thorkel's warriors, drunk on iron and rage, tore through his village. He was spared not out of mercy, but pragmatism. A boy's back could carry wood, his size, ideal for the shadows of tents and longships. Over time, his Saxon tongue reshaped into guttural Norse. His name remained Togger, but only as a jest meaningless, powerless. Yet Thorkel had never treated him as disposable. He was a shadow given shape-feeding warriors, mending armour, even standing speechless at Thorkel's right hand during war councils. The warlord taught him to track, to kill, to observe, but never to speak out of turn, never to dream beyond the tent flaps. Now, with King Ethelred's bounty whispering freedom into his ear, Togger's silent obedience curdled into a slow, aching rebellion. It wasn't hatred for Thorkel that grew, it was the weight of decades spent invisible. The knowledge that, to Thorkel, even after 25 winters, he was just a sharp-minded thrall. Useful, loyal, but not a brother. Could any act redeem years of enforced servitude? Could one stroke of justice, born from betrayal, cleanse centuries of chains? Each day in hiding brought the question closer to his hands. Ethelred's promise echoed. Land, freedom, a name of his choosing. The taste of agency had never known anything sweeter or more terrifying. But with the sword came an answer. It was not clean, not righteous, but sharpened by necessity. In that cold hut, his heart beat like a drum of memorevery insult. Every order barked beneath the stars of foreign gods. He didn't hate Thorkel, but he loved freedom more. In killing his master, Togger did not escape the consequences of his past the carved space for a new one, even if it was short-lived. Even if he'd be damned forever as traitor, not liberator, because some chains were made of iron, others of silence. It was the dead of night, no stars, no moon, just the hush of pine needles sighing in the wind and the flicker of fire embers dying in the hearth. Inside the crude wooden shelter, Thorkel the Red lay buried beneath furs, his chest rising with the deep, rhythmic breath of exhaustion. For days, they had fled deeper into the woods, hiding from patrols loyal to King Ethelred. The warlord's wounds had reopened. Fever gnawed at his resolve. And yet he trusted the man who ladled his broth and checked his bandages. Togger, the faithful thrall, the shadow that had followed him for 25 years. But now, that shadow stood still. Togger stared into the fire, unmoving. In his hand, he held a bladnot fancy, just sharp, a Saxon make. His fingers clenched and unclenched, as though wrestling the ghost of hesitation. His eyes moved not to his master, but to the worn sword that leaned against the wall, the very weapon he had witnessed cleave heads in battle. And yet what was loyalty to a man born in chains? The silence became unbearable. Togger moved. He approached Thorkel quietly, deliberately, each step echoing with memory. Of fields burning in his childhood, of Norse laughter drowning out the cries of his kin, of long winters serving stew before cleaning blood from armour. Thorkel had taught him to fight. Almost. The warlord stirred, coughed his body too weary to sense betrayal. Togger stood above him, breath shallow, blade shaking. There was no ceremony, no words, just one clean arc. The sword parted flesh and fate, severing master from memory. Blood soaked into fur. The forest exhaled. Togger fell back, gasping. The noise in his mind was deafening. He did not cry. He did not pray. Carefully, he wrapped the head in linen. A crude courtesy for a man he had once obeyed, feared, and in strange and bitter ways, perhaps even loved. He buried the body in a hollow behind the hut. Stones marked nothing. Then he walked, alone, toward the firelit horizon of Ethelred's camp. With every step, the name Togger faded. The man who had served, knelt, and waited was gone. Ahead lay silver, land may be freedom. Behind lay silence. The slave had lifted a sword. The courtyard of King Ethelred's hall buzzed with whispers as Togonow called. Paul stepped forward, the bloodied cloth bundle in his hands. Upon unveiling Thorkel's severed head, silence fell like an axe through the crowd. The old pagan warlord, once feared along every shore of the eastern kingdoms, was finally dead. Nobles murmured prayers. Priests crossed themselves. Ethelred smiled not with joy, but with calculation. Togger was rewarded. The gold shimmered in the torchlight, heavy in its pouch. A scribe etched his new Christian name Paul into the parchment of the court's records. A small acre of land promised outside Lincoln. The reward had come, just as the king had offered. Yet the air was thick with something else, suspicion. He was dressed in new woolen garments, his feet for the first time in years free of mud and ash. But the servants who once ignored him now watched him too long, too silently. A noble refused to hold his gaze during the ceremonial blessing. Though he stood before them as a freedman, his presence unsettled. Ethelred's adviser, robes stiff with purity, leaned in and whispered, "This cannot stand." The king, lips tight, gave no answer. Behind his eyes simmered the thought. A slave who lays his master low might too easily forget his station might inspire others. Togger felt the shift like a chill under the skin. The gold weighed heavier than the years he had worn chains. He wandered the halls like a ghost in unfamiliar light. Nobility may have been offered in title, but never in truth. He spent 2 nights in the side chambers of the castle, watched by guards who claimed they were for protection. On the 3rd morning, the reward turned to accusation. A decree signed and sealed by Ethelred, himself condemning Togger for treason. The court cited no betrayal of Thorkel, but disloyalty to the divine ordering of society. A slave, regardless of cause, had no right to take a noble's life. He was dragged once more in chains, but this time, no shackles of iron. Instead, he was bound by something colder, the law, twisted by fear. Those who had exalted his act now painted it with poison. Still, he clenched the memory of that blade's swing to his chester. Freedom gained, however brief, that no man could take back. The crowd gathered in silence, the air thick with frost and foreboding. 3 days had passed since Togonow dubbed Paul walked into Ethelred's court with the severed head of his master. 3 days since gold had been pressed into his hand, and promises of land whispered into his ear. But promises are light as ash, and the weight of fear heavier than iron. At the centre of the cold courtyard stood a wooden scaffold, its planks dusted with snow. Togger, manacled and silent, looked neither afraid nor defiant. His eyes, wearied but unwavering, scanned the faces before him not for mercy, but for meaning. He saw none. Ethelred himself did not come. Instead, his court advisers presided, cloaked in crimson and authority. The words read were heavy with legal form, but their soul was suspicion. "He slew a man not in battle, but in sleep," began the noble spokesman, his voice rising to convince the gathered masses as much as himself. "He betrayed not one master, but the laws of loyalty." Whispers rippled, some of agreement, some of unease. For while many feared the precedent of a slave killing his master, others quietly asked what justice remained in punishing the very act that hadn't Ethelred himself rewarded. An adviser stepped forth, laying down the verdict with cold finality. By law, he is a thrall who took initiative without leave. By faith, he is a man unbaptized in soul, though dressed in Christian name. By reason, one who betrays once will betray twice. Togger, compelled forward, mounted the scaffold. The executioner stood by, hooded, impassive. A hush fell as the condemned was asked for final words. He looked skyward, then to no one, and spoke with calm clarity. "A sword gave me freedom." The blade fell swiftly. Among the onlookers, the monk who would later write this tale dipped his quill. In his scroll, he would not name Togger a saint nor villain, but a paradox freed in death, bound in history. The nobles left satisfied. The guards returned to formation. The snow quietly covered blood already cooling. Justice had been done, so they told themselves. Centuries after Togger's final breath, his name remains absent from the grand scrolls of kings and saints, yet whispered still in footnotes and fields. His actions, etched in no runestone and celebrated in no saga, stirred a ripple far beyond his own short existence. In the cold space between slave and free man, loyalty and vengeance, His blade carved not just a neck, but a question that haunted generations. Can chains forged by conquest ever be severed without blood? For Anglo-Saxon nobility and Christian chroniclers, Toghaith man they renamed Paul was a distasteful anomaly. His beheading of a pagan enemy aligned with their cause, yet his origins subverted the very order they claimed divine. A slave killing a lord was not redemption, it was an affront to God's hierarchy on earth. Thus, they silenced him, not only with rope and executioner's blade, but with a mission, with the erasure afforded only to those inconvenient to history's victors. But among servants, debt-burdened villains, and the descendants of the conquered, quiet echoes of his act survived. In oral tales, passed near hearth-fires, in whispers among the kitchen smoke of monasteries, Togha's story endured not as treachery, but grim inspiration. He had done what few dared, raised hand against a master not out of rage, but reason. His was not the fury of rebellion, but the calculation of a man offered a mirror of possibility freedom, cruelly granted only if he exchanged one chain for another. And for those who built law upon land and station, his tale became a warning. Noblemen shuddered at the precedent he set. From then on, kings were wary of rewarding the lower born for eliminating their enemies. Decrees were written more carefully. Rewards came only to those of rank, and whispers of mercy toward bondsmen grew quiet. The fear Togha conjured the fear that the oppressed might not remain. Docile became the mortar of deeper control. Historians now peer back through veil and scripture, finding in Togha a rare light among violent times. He was no martyr, no villain pure. His crime was complex because his life was complex, shaped by raids, religion, loyalty, and loss. He served gods he never chose, men he never loved, and a fate he did not deserve. History walks a fine line between judgment and understanding. In the case of Togha, the thrall-later, known as Paltha, question lingers like smoke on a frozen battlefield. Was he a villain or a vindicator? To the Saxon elite, his act was monstrous. Executioners say he betrayed not one man, but the very foundation of society. A slave had drawn steel against his master not in battle, not in fair revolt, but by night, with silence and deliberation. A submission turned subversion. Even in death, Thorkel was still nobility, still a war-tested leader of men. Togha, despite gold in his pockets and a Christian name spoken from a king's lips, remained what the court saw as unworthy of moral agency. His story was co-opted into a cautionary tale, that a slave, even when useful, should never be trusted. But history has two faces. To others perhaps, silent thralls who scrubbed blood from the stones of war camps, or Saxon peasants forced to bend knee to foreign blades. Togha was more than a footnote. He was an answer to long-muted prayers. For 25 years he had knelt before the fire of his master, fetching wine, binding wounds, burying the dead at his command. Not because he believed in Thorkel's cause, but because he had no choice. Power wore the face of Thorkel the pagan scars, the smirk of commandant for a moment. Togha held that power in his hands, and chose to end it. What makes betrayal? Is it the breaking of allegiance, or the claiming of self? The chronicler who tells us his tail-scratching ink over parchment cannot quite decide. Perhaps Togha did not betray Thorkel. Perhaps Thorkel, by forgetting that even the obedient suffer, had invited death at his own hearth. Yet Togha's story ends not in triumph, but in silence. Moments after tasting what freedom might feel like, he is led to the gallows not fettered by chains, but by fear. Ethelred feared what his reward had unleashed, the spectre of empowerment from below the social line. If one thrall dares sever a master's head for liberty, who else might be watching the sword rack? And so history does not choose. It hesitates. Togha is not lionized in tapestries, nor cursed in prophecy. He exists in the shadows between hero and betrayer, between man and symbol. His act remains a wound in the narrative of mastery, one that refuses to heal cleanly.